There is a life you are waiting to begin. Not this one exactly. This one is fine, you tell yourself, but provisional. You are waiting for the version of it that starts after certain things have been resolved. After the situation at work clarifies. After the relationship finds its footing, or ends, or transforms into something more clearly what it should be. After the money is less of a concern. After you feel more like yourself. After whatever is currently making this feel like the waiting room rather than the destination has passed. You have been waiting a long time, and the thing you may be beginning to suspect, quietly, in hours like this one, is that the waiting room has been the life. That the real life you have been waiting to inhabit has been available this entire time, and you have not been in it because you have been somewhere slightly ahead of it, managing the gap between what is here and what should be here. Before we begin, leave one word in the comments tonight. One word for what you have been waiting for. Later, after, when, almost. Whatever is most honest, someone will read it and recognize the same waiting in themselves. If this channel is finding you something worth returning to, the subscribe button is there. It costs nothing. Now, close your eyes if they are ready. Tonight's stories come from 6 traditions and 8 centuries. A Chinese scholar of the Song Dynasty who spent 20 years preparing to write a great poem and understood, on the morning he finally sat down to write, that the preparation had consumed the life the poem was supposed to describe. A Japanese farmer's widow of the Muromachi period who postponed her grief for 3 years, waiting until she had more time to feel it properly, and found the grief still patient and waiting when she finally arrived. A Tibetan nomad who spent his entire working life moving toward a place he had been told was more beautiful than where he was, and who found it, and found it was. A Korean potter of the early Joseon period who waited for the perfect clay before beginning the bowl that became the most important work of his life, and who understood what the waiting had cost him. A Burmese laywoman who lived in the same house for 60 years, telling herself she would properly notice it once the children were grown, once the husband retired, once the particular pressures of each season had passed, and who finally sat down and looked at it, really looked, in her 72nd year. And a very old Vietnamese monk who was asked, on the last morning of his teaching life, what he would do differently, and who said, without hesitation, that he would have arrived sooner at the life he was always already living. These stories are contemplative in nature, offered for rest and reflection, not as medical or therapeutic advice. Simply stories, simply this. Feel where your body meets whatever is beneath it right now. This is the life, not the one after the next thing. This body, this breath, this specific hour that is not the waiting room for anything else. This. The stories are waiting, or rather, they have always been here. In the city of Hangzhou during the southern Song Dynasty, in the late 12th century, there was a scholar named Zhong Wen, not the official of the gathering story, but a different man of the same name, a scholar who had spent 20 years preparing to write a great poem. He was 44 years old. He had been a scholar of the classical tradition since his early 20s, a student of the Tang masters whose poems had defined what a poem could be, a reader of every significant commentary on those poems, a practitioner of the forms and techniques that the tradition had developed across centuries. He was, by any measure his world offered, thoroughly prepared. The poem he intended to write was about the experience of being alive in a particular season, in a particular city, the specific quality of early spring in Hangzhou when the West Lake began to show its first green, and the air had the specific lightness of the transition between cold and warmth. He had experienced this season 20 times since arriving in the city. He had noted the observations he would use. He had identified the technical approach, the form, the specific qualities of diction and image that the poem required. He had not written it. not because he was avoiding it, because he was preparing for it. Each year the spring arrived, and he found some additional reading to do, some refinement of his understanding of the tradition, some aspect of his craft that needed further development before the poem could be what it needed to be. The preparation was genuine. The refinements were real. His understanding of the tradition deepened every year. The spring kept arriving and passing while he prepared to write about it. In the 20th year of this preparation, on a morning in early spring when the West Lake was doing exactly what it had been doing every year for 20 years, a young student who had been studying with him for several months asked when he would begin the poem. He said, "When I am ready." The student, who was 22 and did not yet know enough to be careful about what he said to his teacher, asked, "What would ready feel like if you don't already know?" He sat with this question. He sat with it through the morning, and through the afternoon, and through the afternoon, and through the evening, long after the student had gone home and the West Lake had changed its light again through the varieties of the day. He understood something, sitting with the question, that he had not allowed himself to understand in 20 years of preparation. He did not know what ready would feel like, because ready was not a feeling. Ready was a story he had been telling himself that allowed him to keep the poem in the future where it would remain perfect and unwritten, rather than in the present where it would have to become real and therefore imperfect and therefore itself. The preparation had been real, the refinements had been real, and they had also been a way of not writing the poem, because the poem, written, would be a specific thing with specific limitations, subject to the judgment of readers and the passage of time and the particular failures of execution that every real poem contains. The poem unwritten was still everything a poem could be. He had been protecting the perfect version by never beginning the actual one. He sat down the following morning and wrote the poem. It took 3 days. It was not the poem he had spent 20 years preparing to write, because no written poem can be the poem that existed in the imagination. It was a poem, real, specific, imperfect in the ways that all real things are imperfect, and entirely itself in the way that only real things can be. It was also, which surprised him, better than anything he had imagined writing, not because the 20 years had not prepared him, but because the 20 years had prepared him for this poem, not for the imaginary perfect one. The poem he wrote was the poem the 20 years of preparation had made possible, not the poem he had been waiting to be ready to write. He sent it to a friend with a letter that contained the sentence, "I waited 20 years to write this. I should have waited 3 days and written it 20 years ago." The other 17 years and 362 days were preparation for the waiting, not for the poem. Whatever you have been preparing for, whatever project or conversation or commitment or version of your life you have been getting ready to begin, the readiness you have been waiting for is not a threshold you cross. It is a story you tell yourself about why the beginning is still ahead. The beginning is here. The preparation has been the beginning, whether you recognized it as such or not. Let the breath be slow now. Let the poem begin, whatever it is, in whatever incomplete and imperfect and actual form it can begin tonight. The West Lake is doing what it does. It has been doing it for 20 years. It will not wait for you to be ready to notice it. And as Zhong Wen sits with his finished poem in the early spring light of Hangzhou and understands what the 20 years were for, we travel now to Japan, where a widow postponed her grief for 3 years, waiting until she had more time to feel it. In a farming village in the province of Mino in central Japan, in the middle years of the Muromachi period, in the 15th century, there was a woman named Muso Joshin, not the carpenter or the nun of the garden, but a farmer's wife who had become a farmer's widow when her husband died in the third month of the year, during the busy season when the fields required everything she and the two remaining children at home had to give. She was 47 years old. Her husband had been ill for several months before he died, which meant she had known this was coming, which meant she had had time to think about how she would grieve when it arrived, and had concluded, practically, that she would grieve after the spring planting was finished. The spring planting finished. The summer growing required her full attention. The autumn harvest could not wait. The winter preparation for the following year's planting filled the months she had imagined might finally offer the space to grieve. 3 years passed. She was not suppressing the grief, she told herself. She was managing the timing of it. The fields were real. The children's needs were real. The specific requirements of a farming household that had lost its most experienced worker were real. The grief was also real, but real in a way that could be addressed later, when there was more room for it. In the third year after her husband's death, she went to the small Zen temple in the nearest town to attend a teaching by a traveling monk who had a reputation for directness. She did not go specifically for help with the postponed grief. She went because she had not left the farm for any purpose other than the market in 3 years, and her body needed to be somewhere other than the fields. The monk's teaching was about a flower that bloomed in the forest without anyone to see it. He asked whether the flower bloomed less fully for lack of an audience. She sat with this through the teaching and through the walk home and through the evening meal and through the night. The flower bloomed when it bloomed, not when someone arrived who was ready to see it, not when the conditions were convenient. When it bloomed. Her grief had been blooming for 3 years. She had been telling it to wait, to postpone itself until she had the time and space to receive it properly. It had not waited. It had been doing what it was doing, in the background of 3 years of farm work, whether she attended to it or not. She had not been protecting herself from grief by postponing it. She had been living alongside unattended grief for 3 years, which was a heavier thing than the grief itself would have been. She sat down that night, after the children were asleep, in the kitchen where she had sat with her husband through many evenings, and she let the grief be what it was. Not dramatically, not in a way that required anything of the children or the farm or the following morning. Simply attending to what had been present and unattended for 3 years. She sat in the kitchen for a long time. When she went to bed, something was different in the quality of the house. Not lighter exactly, more real. The house her husband had lived in and died in, which she had been managing for 3 years from a slight distance, became, in the kitchen that night, the house where she also lived. She said, to a younger neighbor woman some years later who was managing her own loss by managing everything around it. The things that need your presence will not wait until you have time. They will simply exist without your presence, which is a different and harder thing than attending to them when they arrive. Grief, like the spring planting, does not wait for a convenient season. It blooms when it blooms. The only question is whether you are there when it does. You may be postponing something tonight. Not grief, necessarily. Some quality of presence that the current season keeps not quite being the right time for. The attentiveness to a relationship. The noticing of a life that is happening around you. The arriving in a place you have been living without fully inhabiting. The flower is blooming. Whether you arrive to see it or not, it is blooming. Let the eyes be soft behind the closed lids. The season does not need your permission to be what it is. And as Muso Joshin sits in the kitchen in the 3rd year and finally attends to what has been waiting, we travel westward to the high plateau of Tibet, where a nomad spent his entire working life moving toward a more beautiful place. In the grazing lands of eastern Tibet, in the 14th century, there was a nomad named Sonam Rinchen, not the trader or the guide of the earlier stories, but a herdsman who had been told by his father, that the best grazing was always to the north, toward the mountains, in the high meadows that the lower altitude herders never reached. He had been moving north, seasonally, his entire working life. Not continuously, the nomadic pattern required movement in cycles, south in winter for shelter, and north in summer for the rich high meadows. But the quality of his attention was always directed toward the north, toward the better grass that was always slightly further than where he was. He was 61 years old. He had been herding his family's animals since he was 12. 49 years of the same seasonal movement, the same watching of the weather, the same reading of the grass and the sky and the water sources that the nomadic tradition required for the animals to thrive. The grass was always better further north. This was objectively true, in the sense that the high meadows were richer than the lower ones. He had spent 49 years moving toward them and away from them with the seasons, and the moving toward them had always had the quality of movement toward something better than where he was. In his 61st year, on a morning in midsummer, at the highest camp his route reached, he sat outside the tent in the early light and looked at the meadow around him. He had arrived, as he arrived every summer, at the best grass. The meadow was exactly what it was every summer. The specific richness of the high plateau in the height of the season, the particular quality of light at altitude, the sound of the animals in the grass, the distant mountains still carrying their snow. He had been here every summer for 49 years. He had, every summer for 49 years, been thinking about the better grass further north. He sat with this for a long time that morning. The better grass further north existed. He had been there. It was genuinely better in certain years and in certain conditions. The attention directed toward it was not wrong as practical attention, but as a way of being in the place he was, it had meant 49 years of being in a good place while directing his attention toward a better one. He had not been in the high meadow for 49 summers. He had been in the high meadow while thinking about the higher meadow. He sat in the high meadow that morning and looked at it, not planning the next movement, not assessing the remaining quality of the grass before the autumn descent, simply looking at where he was. The meadow was extraordinary. He had always known this intellectually. He had not, before this morning, known it the way you know something when you are actually present with it, rather than passing through it on the way to somewhere else. He stayed in the high meadow that morning longer than practical necessity required. His son, who would inherit the herding, came to find him and asked what he was doing. He said, "Looking at where we are." His son looked at the meadow. He said, "We are here every summer." He said, "I know. This is the first time I have been here." His son did not entirely understand. He came to understand it later, in his own 61st year, sitting in the same meadow on a similar morning, which was when he finally understood what his father had meant. The life available to you right now, in the place where you actually are, may be considerable. The attention that is directed toward where you will be when certain things have resolved, when the situation has improved, when you have arrived at the version of your life that feels like the real one. That attention is not wrong exactly, but it means that the place where you are is passing while you look toward the place you are going. Tonight the meadow is here, not the next meadow, this one, the specific quality of this hour, this body, this breath in this particular dark. How long have you been passing through it? Let the body be completely settled now, not on its way anywhere, here, in the high meadow, in the only summer that is available tonight. And as Sonam Rinchen sits in the high meadow in his 61st year and finds it extraordinary after 49 summers of passing through it, we travel eastward to Korea, where a potter waited for the perfect clay before beginning the most important bowl of his life. In the province of Jeolla in southern Korea, in the early years of the Joseon period, in the late 14th century, when the Celadon tradition of the Goryeo period was giving way to the whiteware tradition that would define Korean ceramics for the following centuries, there was a potter named Sojung, not the widow of the box of letters, but a craftsman of the same name who had been working with clay since his father's workshop, a man of considerable skill who had produced, across 30 years, some of the most technically accomplished vessels in his region. He was 53 years old. He had been planning, for the past several years, to make a bowl. Not an ordinary bowl. The bowl he had in mind was something he had been thinking about for a long time, a specific quality of form and glaze that he had never quite achieved in 30 years of competent work. A bowl that would be, as he understood it, the fullest expression of what he had spent 30 years learning to do. He had not made it because he had not yet found the right clay. The clay he used for regular work was adequate, and his vessels were excellent. But for this bowl, he needed something specific, a particular quality of body that he had worked with once, years before, from a source that had since been exhausted. He had been searching, occasionally, across several years, for clay of that quality. He had not found it. In the meantime, he made other vessels, good vessels. The bowl waited. In the 53rd year of his life, a student who had been in his workshop for 2 years watched him set aside a piece of clay he had been testing and asked why. He said, "Not the right quality, not for that bowl." The student looked at the clay. Then he asked, with the directness of someone who does not yet know what questions to avoid, "What would the bowl look like if you made it with this clay?" He did not answer immediately. He held the clay in his hands. He had held it to test its quality for the bowl he was planning and had found it wanting in specific technical ways. It was not wrong clay. It was not the clay he was waiting for. What would the bowl look like? He sat at the wheel. He worked with the clay he had, not planning the bowl he had been planning, making the bowl that this clay was capable of being. It took 2 days. The glaze required adjustments for the specific quality of the body. The form that emerged was not the form he had imagined. It was different, more responsive to the particular properties of the clay, which had its own qualities that the clay he had been waiting for would not have had. When he took it from the kiln, he held it for a long time. It was not the bowl he had been planning to make. It was a bowl of a different kind of beauty, the beauty that comes from working with what is actually present rather than what is ideally imagined. He placed it on the shelf in his workshop where his best work was displayed. It remained there for the rest of his life. The student asked him, later, whether he had found the right clay for the bowl he had been planning. He said, "I found something better. I found the bowl that was possible rather than the bowl that was perfect." He paused. "The perfect bowl does not exist. I knew this, and I have been waiting for the clay to make it anyway. What exists is the bowl that can be made from whatever clay is in the hands right now. That bowl is always available. The other one never is. The life you are postponing until the conditions are right is not more beautiful than the life available in the conditions that are actually here. It is simply imaginary, which allows it to be perfect in the way that imaginary things can be perfect, which is to say, in the way that has no relationship to what is actually possible. The clay in your hands tonight is this life, imperfect in its specific ways, available in its specific ways, capable of becoming something that the imagined perfect conditions could never have produced, because those conditions would have produced a different bowl, not a better one. Let the hands be open now, soft, receiving whatever is in them. The clay is here. The wheel is turning. The bowl that is possible in these conditions is the only bowl there is. And as Sojung places his best bowl on the shelf of his workshop in the Joseon morning, we travel southward to Burma. where a woman lived in the same house for 60 years before she finally sat down and looked at it. In a town in the Irrawaddy Valley of central Burma, in the early 20th century, there was a woman named Daw Sain, not the woman of the 30-year anger or the 2 falls, but a different woman of the same name, a laywoman of the Theravada tradition who had been living in the same house for 60 years. She was 72 years old. She had moved into the house as a young bride at 12, which was the custom of her time and place, and had lived in it through the raising of 6 children, the death of a husband, the departure of children to their own lives, the contraction of the household to herself, and, for many years, 1 remaining daughter. She had, in 60 years, never properly looked at her house. Not in the sense of not seeing it. She had been in it every day. She knew every room, every beam, every repair that had been made across 60 years of a wooden structure requiring continuous maintenance. She knew the specific quality of the light in the main room at different times of day, the way the afternoon light came through the eastern window and moved across the floor in a particular pattern that she had observed 10,000 times from the periphery of her attention. She had never sat in the main room with the specific intention of noticing where she was. There had always been something that needed doing. Children, then grandchildren, then the ordinary maintenance of a household, then the particular attentiveness of old age to the body's requirements. She had told herself, across decades, that she would properly appreciate the house when there was more time, when the current pressure had passed, when the season was less demanding. In her 72nd year, on an afternoon in the dry season, when the grandchildren who usually filled the house with noise had returned to their parents and the daughter who lived with her was visiting relatives in another town, Daw Sain sat down in the main room with nothing that needed doing. She sat and looked at the room. She sat for a long time. The afternoon light moved across the floor in the pattern she had observed from the periphery of her attention for 60 years. She watched it move. She noticed the specific quality of it, the particular warmth of late afternoon light in the dry season, the way it illuminated the dust in the air, the shadows it made behind the simple furniture. She noticed the quality of the silence when the house was empty of its usual movement, not lonely, simply still, with the specific quality of stillness that a house has when it is inhabited but temporarily quiet. She noticed the smell of the wood, which was 60 years of accumulated warmth and cooking, and the specific scent of teakwood aging. She had smelled this her entire adult life. She had not, before this afternoon, noticed it as something to notice. She sat in the room until the light changed completely and the evening came. She said to her daughter, when the daughter returned that evening, "I sat in the main room this afternoon." Her daughter said, "Is something wrong with the room?" She said, "No, I was looking at it." Her daughter, who was 48 and practical, asked, "What for?" She sat with this question for a while. Then she said, "I have been living here for 60 years. I thought it was time I arrived. Whatever house you have been living in while waiting to arrive in it, whatever life you have been managing from the periphery of your attention while directing that attention toward the version that will begin when circumstances allow, the afternoon light is moving across the floor right now. It has been moving for 60 years. It will move again tomorrow, regardless of whether the circumstances have improved. You do not have to wait until the house is emptied of its demands to sit down in it. You can sit down in the middle of the demands. They will still be there when you stand up, but the afternoon light will have moved. Let the eyes be closed and the attention be here, in this room, in this body, in this specific hour, not managing, not preparing, simply here, in the house you have always been living in. And as Daw-Sane watches the evening come into the room she has finally arrived in after 60 years, we come now to the last story, to Vietnam, and to an old monk who was asked what he would do differently. In a monastery in the hills above Da Nang, in central Vietnam, in the middle years of the 20th century, there was a monk named Thich Minh Tam, who was, at the time of this story, 83 years old, and had been practicing as a monk for 65 of those years. He was known, in the modest way of monks who have not sought fame, for the specific quality of his presence, a quality that those who met him described variously as complete attention, or being entirely there, or the particular quality of someone for whom the conversation happening is the only conversation that matters. On the last day of his formal teaching, a young novice who had been at the monastery for 6 months asked him the question that young students ask on last days. He asked, "What would you do differently?" The old monk sat with this for a long time. He said, "I would arrive sooner." The young novice waited for elaboration. The old monk said, "I spent the first 30 years of my practice waiting to be a different kind of monk than I was. More concentrated, more understanding. Further along the path, I practiced consistently, I sat every morning, I followed the precepts, I attended the teachings. But inside the practice, there was always a gap between the monk I was and the monk I was trying to become. And that gap meant I was never quite in the practice I was in. I was always slightly ahead of it, in the practice that would be available when I had closed the gap." He paused. After 30 years, something happened that I cannot describe precisely. The gap did not close. I simply stopped experiencing it as a gap. The monk I was practicing as was the monk who was practicing, not the monk I would be when the practice had matured. The actual monk, sitting on the actual cushion, breathing the actual morning air. He looked at the young novice. "I do not know if you can hear what I am telling you. I could not have heard it when I was your age. But I will say it anyway so that perhaps you will remember it later when you are able to hear it. The life you are in is the life, not the life you will have when you have become who you are practicing to become, not the practice that will be available when you have resolved what you are currently trying to resolve. This morning, this monastery, this slightly uncomfortable cushion in this particular light." He paused. "I spent 30 years waiting to arrive in this life. I have been in it for 35. The 35 years when I was here were the same life as the 30 years when I was waiting to arrive. The difference was only in whether I was present for it." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Arrive sooner. That is all. Whatever you are waiting to have resolved before you consider yourself fully present, resolve it differently. Not by resolving it, by being present before it is resolved. The life does not begin after the resolution. The life is the resolution, if you are in it." The young novice sat with this for the rest of the day and for many years after. He said, in his own old age, that he had not understood it when he heard it, that he had spent 20 more years after hearing it in the same slightly ahead position, waiting to close a gap that was not a gap in his practice, but a gap in his willingness to be in the practice he was in. And then one morning, without announcement, the gap was simply not there. Not because anything had been resolved, because he had finally arrived in the morning that was actually present. He said, "It is the same morning every day. The difference is whether you are in it." Tonight is a morning, or an evening, or the middle of a night. Whatever it is the life. Not the provisional version, not the waiting room. The old monk's question is available to you now, not as instruction, as invitation. What are you waiting to resolve before you consider yourself fully arrived? You do not have to answer tonight, but you can let the question rest here, with you, in the life that is already present, already enough. already the thing you have been waiting for permission to be in. We have traveled far tonight, to the Hangzhou study, where a scholar finally wrote the poem he had spent 20 years preparing to write, and understood that the preparation had been the waiting, not the poem. To the farmhouse in Mino, where a widow attended to the grief she had been postponing for 3 years, and found the house more real afterward. To the high meadow of the Tibetan plateau, where a nomad sat in the summer grass for the first time after 49 summers of passing through it on the way to better grass further north. To the pottery workshop in Chosun, Korea, where a craftsman made the bowl that was possible rather than waiting for the clay required by the bowl that was perfect. To the Burmese house, where a woman sat in the room she had been living in for 60 years and finally arrived in it. And to the monastery in the hills above Da Nang, where a very old monk told a young novice the only thing he would have done differently: arrive sooner. 6 traditions, 8 centuries, 6 different ways of discovering the same thing. The life you have been postponing is this one. Not a different version of it, arrived at after certain conditions have been met. This specific life, in this specific body, in this specific moment, that is not a waiting room for anything more real than itself. You have been here the whole time. The question is only whether you have been present while you were here. Tonight, for the length of this dark, you are here. Not managing, not preparing, not directing your attention toward the version of your life that begins after. Simply here, in the house you have always been living in the meadow you have always been passing through, in the morning that is always already present. Let the names dissolve now. Zongwen, Muso Joshin, Sonam Rinchen, Sojung, Da Sain, Tich Min Tam. What remains is what has always been here. The breath, already arriving. The body, already held. The life, already present, requiring nothing additional before it is fully itself. Just this, just now, just the ordinary, extraordinary fact of being alive in this particular dark, at this particular hour. You have arrived. You were always arriving. If sleep is reaching for you, let it come. The morning will be here when you open your eyes. Not a different morning. This one, continuing. Good night. You are already here. Before you go, one small thing. I made this channel because I believe the most important journey any of us makes is not the one toward a better version of our life, but the one toward the life we are already living. If tonight brought you one moment of actually being in the room you are in, I am genuinely glad. Leave one word in the comments if you feel like it. One word for what you have been postponing. Someone will read it. And if the quiet Dharma is somewhere you want to return, the subscribe button is there. It costs nothing. It just means the next time a night like this one comes, this will be waiting. Good night. You are already here.